He spent 2 years planning to bump a stranger's shoulder in the street. He sold the fur collar off his coat to pay for it. This is the man called too conscious to act. Nothing in his account says he was confused. He gives the case against himself first, in better sentences than yours. You do the same thing in one sentence about yourself first. You have always called that the beginning of repair. Start with the one man who never once claimed he did not know. Part 1. You already know what you are doing. A man is walking from a table to a stove and back again. There are 4 men in the room, and they have stopped noticing that he is there. He starts at 8 in the evening and stops at 11. 3 hours, the same few feet of floor. During those 3 hours he is 3 times soaked with sweat and dry again, and he is narrating it to himself while it happens. No one, he says, could have gone out of his way to degrade himself more shamelessly. He fully realized it, and went on pacing. You have a version of that room. The message you read back 4 times, knowing exactly what sending it would cost, and sent. The sentence at dinner you said precisely so that they would think less of you. There was a voice inside describing the whole operation to you while you ran it. The description was accurate. It changed nothing. The ordinary account of that assumes you did not quite see it. Almost every explanation of self-defeating behavior needs a gap somewhere between the person and the facts. You were confused about the cost, or a feeling shortened your view of it, or the name you gave the act was flattering enough to hide what the act was. Which is why every repair anyone has ever recommended has the same shape. Look at it directly, say it plainly, and find the motive underneath the reason you gave. The premise underneath all of it is that describing a thing is the first half of stopping it. That premise is not stupid, and you are running your life on it. It is why you go back over the message afterwards and work out honestly why you sent it. And underneath that, if you can name what you are doing, you have started to stop. Dostoevsky built a case with the gap taken out. It is in the 4th chapter, and it is a man with toothache. He has had it for a month, and he moans. On the first night, the moaning is more or less honest. By the 3rd day, it has been worked on. The moans have acquired trills and flourishes, and he is explicit that he could moan more simply. They have become, in his word, malignant, and he says the malignancy is the whole point. This is a moan composed by an educated man, not the sound of an animal in pain. Any theory of self-defeat needs something to be true of the person, that he is confused or wrong about how it looks, or blind to the damage. He goes through those one at a time and rules each one out about himself. Does he believe the moaning helps? He knows he is doing himself no sort of good with his moans. Is he wrong about his audience? He knows the household listens to him with loathing and does not put a ha'porth of faith in him. Is he unaware of the damage? He knows better than anyone that he is only lacerating and harassing himself and others for nothing. He even puts the household side of it into his own mouth. I am worrying you, I am lacerating your hearts, I am keeping everyone in the house awake. I am not a hero to you now, as I tried to seem before, but simply a nasty person, an imposter. Every one of those admissions is on the page before anybody accuses him of anything. And then he goes back and improves the moan. So look at what is left standing when all of that has been subtracted. A man in full possession of the facts, doing it anyway and composing it as he goes. Every explanation of self-defeat assumes the person cannot see it. He sees it in real time, in complete sentences, and it changes nothing. Which means the seeing was never the thing that was missing. The book comes in two halves. The first is the argument, written by a man of 40, and the toothache is in it. The second is his memoir of himself at 24, and the pacing is in that one. The toothache is the claim. The 3 hours from the table to the stove are the evidence from 20 years before he made it. Same man, both halves, watching himself with total clarity in each. In the second one, he does not sit still. He paces, he sweats, he addresses the sofa his enemies are sitting on for 3 hours. Whatever the consciousness was doing to him, it was not stopping him. Now the objection, and it is the right one. This is one man, and he is a witness who has told you he lies. In the last chapter of the book's opening half, he writes out the reader's verdict on himself. Out of the pettiest vanity you expose your sincerity to publicity and ignominy. Lies, lies, lies. And then he admits it. Of course, I have myself made up all the things you say. The most vivid scene of degradation in the whole book never happened either. He describes how he might have been positively glad of a slap in the face. 2 paragraphs earlier, he says plainly that he has never been slapped. So the strongest case is a thing he thought of, and the rest is one toothache. 1 month, 1 household, 1 narrator, reported at 40 by a man arranging his own past. What you have there is an anecdote with a thesis attached to it, and an anecdote settles nothing about human beings. The reply leaves his unreliability standing. It points to the same structure produced in people who are not him under measurement. Wilson and Schooler published the experiment in 1991 under the title Thinking Too Much. They had people rate ordinary things, including jams that expert tasters had already ranked. Students who first wrote out why they liked what they liked ended up ranking the jams further from the experts. Their explanation is exact, and it is not that thinking is bad. Analyzing reasons can focus attention on non-optimal criteria. The reasons you can put into words are not the ones your preference was actually running on. So you talk yourself into the answer you can defend rather than the one you would have liked. 8 years later, Lyubomirsky, Tucker, Caldwell and Berg ran the version that bites harder. Dysphoric participants were directed to think about themselves, or directed away from themselves. The self-focused ones rated their own biggest problems as severe and unsolvable, and they reported a reduced likelihood of actually implementing their solutions. Not the ability to name the solution, the willingness to carry it out. The manipulation was attention to the self, and it lowered the chance of acting on what they already knew. State the limit in the same breath, because the limit is where the argument actually stands. Nolan Hexamer in 2000 found that rumination predicted new onsets of depressive episodes. It also predicted how long those disorders lasted, until she accounted for how depressed people already were. After that adjustment, the prediction of chronicity did not survive. So the effects are real. They show up when you measure people forward in time, and they are small. They show that consciousness degrades the fit between what you choose and what satisfies you. They do not show that it paralyzes anybody. He claims far more than that. He says that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness. The measurements give him a small effect in students. He turns it into a diagnosis of the whole species. That is more than he is owed, and it should be said at the first opportunity. But there is something the corrections do not reach, and it is back on the third day. Notice the direction of it. He is working on the accuracy, the way you work on a draft. The moan gets trills. The pacing gets a finished sentence about how shamelessly he degraded himself and how fully he realized it. Nobody describes himself that precisely for nothing. So what is the accuracy buying? Part 2. Why you say the worst thing about yourself. First, you get there first. Before anyone can call you lazy, you call yourself lazy harder and funnier than they would have. The book does the same thing in its opening breath. I am a sick man, followed by 4 dots. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. Between the first sentence and the second, nothing happens in the room. Nobody has spoken, nobody has answered, and the writer is alone with a pen. Something intervened anyway, and this whole part is about what it was. Bakhtin slows those 3 sentences down until the intervention becomes visible. The hero begins in a plaintive tone, and then he hears his own tone. I am a sick man is a complaint, and a complaint asks somebody for sympathy, which concedes that there is somebody whose sympathy he needs. So an imagined listener registers the bid, and the writer is enraged by what he just sounded like. Bakhtin's paraphrase of the turn is close to a taunt. You were perhaps led to believe from my first word that I am seeking your sympathy. So take this. I am a spiteful man. The 4 dots are the length of a conversation that had no second participant. The obvious reading of that move is weakness, and it deserves to be put charitably. He is insecure, he cannot bear to be pitied, so he snaps at his own softness. That reading makes the book a case study, and a case study cannot be argued with. Bakhtin's move is to take the contradiction out of the man and put it into the sentences. His finding about the text is flat and checkable. In the whole of it, he reports, there is not one firm, undivided word. The argument that explains why runs one premise at a time. A confession says what a person finally is, and it presents itself as the last word. Now, suppose such a statement is uttered and accepted by the listener and by the speaker. Then the person has been finalized. He becomes a being that can be spied on, defined, and predicted apart from its own will. If that description sticks, the man in it is finished, not dead, settled. There is nothing left for him to decide about himself. So he has an overriding interest in never letting a self-definition close. But silence is not available either, and this is the premise people skip. If he says nothing, the other man's definition of him stands unopposed. So he must speak, and what he says must not be final. One move satisfies both conditions at once. Say something that looks like a verdict and structurally is not one. Bakhtin calls this the word with a loophole. A loophole, in his definition, is the retention of the possibility of altering the final meaning of your own words. The sentence sounds final. He built it so it would sound final. But the full stop at the end is provisional. He can always come back and change what it meant. So the word that looks like his last word is only his second to last. Bakhtin's phrase for that mark is a conditional period. A man can mean every syllable of his confession and still leave the exit open. That explains why the confession never ends. It does not yet explain why the self-description has to be the ugliest one available. The second device answers that, and it is the one you live inside. Another person's verdict has power over you only if it can arrive as news. If you have already said it, worse and first, their version arrives as a repetition. Bakhtin's name for this is the destruction of one's own image in another's eyes. He calls it a desperate effort to free oneself from the power of the other's consciousness. For that reason, he says, the underground man makes his discourse about himself deliberately ugly. You can watch it work on a single line in Chapter 1. He makes a joke and immediately calls it a poor jest. He says he wrote it thinking it would sound witty. He says he can now see that he only wanted to show off in a despicable way. And then he says he will not scratch it out on purpose. Count what has happened there. He has convicted himself of vanity and preserved the evidence, which is a second and subtler vanity. The self-accusation is where he is hiding. So look at what the accuracy is actually buying. A person who has already said the worst thing about himself cannot be told anything. That is not a side effect of the honesty. That is what the honesty is for. There is a cost, and Bakhtin states it almost as a proof. The point of getting there first is to show that the other man's opinion does not matter. To show that, he has to address him. Addressing him displays the dependence he is denying. So, with his refutation, he confirms exactly what he wishes to refute, and he knows it. The machine runs in the open in one paragraph of Part 2. He says you will call this vulgar and base, and then he agrees that it is. Then he says the basest thing of all is that he has started justifying himself to you. Then he says it is baser still to have just made that remark. Then he stops because there will be no end to it, each step more base than the last. Bakhtin's term for the result is a perpetuum mobile, an endless machine with no forward motion. All of that describes a man who cannot be finalized by anybody, including his author. That last clause is where the trouble is. René Vellec took the whole framework apart on exactly this point in 1980. Bakhtin approvingly quotes a line about Shakespeare from Chernyshevsky. Othello says yes, Iago says no, Shakespeare says nothing. Welleck's reply is one sentence long. But Shakespeare said no to Iago very clearly. Every dramatist lets a view reach its full strength. Shakespeare did that and still passed judgment on Iago. Citing Catteau's work on the notebooks, Relic says Dostoevsky never lost control over his figures, and his verdict is not softened at the end. He finds it disconcerting that Bakhtin propounded a theory which renders Dostoevsky harmless and makes him a relativist. The local version of that charge is worse because Bakhtin supplies the evidence for it himself. He classifies this book generically as a diatribe, which he glosses as a conversation with an absent interlocutor. His own words for it are saturated with overt and hidden polemic. He also ranks the two. Hidden polemic is the deeper case because the other man's voice has got inside the sentence. Overt polemic is the shallower one, because the writer is just arguing with him out loud. And this book, by his own account, is full of the overt kind. The other man here has a name. Part 1 is aimed at Chernyshevsky and the rational egoists whom Dostoevsky attacked in his journalism under his own name. So the freest voice in 19th century fiction may be an artifact of critical piety. We admire the theory, so we credit the book with a freedom its polemic contradicts. The reply available is narrower than the theory it is defending, and it is stronger for that. Everything said here about the loophole is a claim about how the hero's sentences are built. None of it requires that Dostoevsky lost control of him. A character built to evade description evades his reader, whatever his author intended. And you are that reader. Whether a novelist kept hold of his creation in 1864 is a question for his notebooks. Whether the move works on the people sitting across from you is a question you can settle tonight. It has been settling itself for years. The largest piece of evidence that the device works on readers is the reception itself. The anthologists and encyclopedias that made this book existentialism's opening statement are a story for later. Those are not careless readers. They are readers meeting a man who has already said the worst about himself, and hearing candour. The people you do it in front of are running the same reading. You hand them the ugliness before they can find it, and they score the ugliness as honesty. That is why nobody has ever corrected you, and why you have never had to stop. None of which makes the loophole admirable, and Bakhtin is explicit that it is not. His own ideal has a name, penetrated discourse, and it is the opposite of everything described here. A word with no sideward glance, no loophole, no internal polemic. Then he adds the condition that decides the whole matter. Such a word is possible only in actual dialogue with another person. In chapter 11 of part 1, the writer admits he will never have readers. Then he admits he may be imagining them anyway, to keep his dignity. So the loophole is what a mouth does when there is nobody in the room, and no more universal than that. A defence on that scale implies an attack. Nobody rebuilds every sentence he owns to be revisable unless something is trying to fix him in place. And this defence carries a date, which is 1864. Something was arriving that year with the power to describe him accurately from the outside, and to be right. That is what made being described feel like being killed. Part 3. The year they proved you could be counted. Somebody has a number for you, and the number is right. By the middle of the 19th century, the post offices of London and Paris were publishing returns of a small clerical failure. They counted the letters whose writers, through forgetfulness, had omitted to address them. Henry Thomas Buckle read those columns and found that the returns are year after year copies of each other. His conclusion, in his own words, for each successive period we can actually foretell the number of persons whose memory will fail them. Not their crimes, their absent-mindedness. Buckle ran the same method over deaths. In London he wrote about 240 persons every year make away with themselves. The annual figure oscillates between 266 at the highest and 213 at the lowest. In 1846, the great year of excitement caused by the railway panic, it was 266. Then 256, then 247, then 213. You can read a financial mania off a suicide column. Marriage, he found, tracks the price of corn. That immense social and religious institution is completely controlled by the price of food and the rate of wages. Buckle's table does not have your name in it. It has your number instead. Before you decide this is Victorian number worship, look at what it was built to solve. Chernyshevsky's anthropological principle, published in 1860, says that a human being is one natural organism. A soul housed in matter has dropped out of the account. Take that seriously, and there is nothing above the body to appeal to, and no divine sanction to fear. Something still has to make a person good, and the only candidate left standing is self-interest. Deliberation becomes a contest of motives in which the strongest passion gains the upper hand over the weaker ones. Then the difference between a scoundrel and a decent man is not that one of them is selfish. It is that one of them is bad at arithmetic. Vice stops being sin and becomes miscalculation, and nobody is damned. That solves a second problem, which is blame. If a woman sells herself because she is starving, punishing her for it is incoherent. Quetelet put it in one sentence. Society prepares crime, and the guilty are only the instruments by which it is executed. Reform the conditions, not the sinner. And the evidence was arriving in volume. In the 1860s, in Greta Matzner-Gore's phrase, Russia was overrun by a craze for statistics. Buckle's History of Civilization in England was translated into Russian in 1861 and printed again in 1863. In 1864, the imperial government set up a central statistical committee. A reviewer in 1865 called statistics the philosopher's stone that antiquity searched for with such effort. Dostoevsky owned a copy of Buckle. One exit was still open, and it is the one you would take. Grant that crowds are regular. Your own willing still feels like yours. In October 1863, that exit closed. Even Sechenov published Reflexes of the Brain in the Medical Bulletin. It put the inside of the head under the same causal description as the knee jerk. The word for cause occurs 165 times in the article. Dostoevsky's notebook carries the entry Memory of Feeling, Sechenov's article, which dates his reading to November or December of that year. He began writing Part 1 about a month later. The exit you are going to take runs through your own head, and this article paves it. Now, what gets built with all of it? In late 1862, from a prison cell, Chernyshevsky asked the commandant for permission to write a novel. He produced the whole of what is to be done in 4 months. The prison censor passed it. The journal censor passed it too. Then the editor Nekrasov lost the manuscript in a cab and got it back only by advertising in the official gazette of the Petersburg police. The police helped retrieve the most subversive book of the century. Inside that book, Vera Pavlovna is shown the future, a crystal house with white columns. They are made of aluminium, her guide explains, because it is hot here and white becomes less heated in the sun. Over the whole courtyard, and for half a verst around it, a white awning is stretched on tall, thin pillars. And then the sentence the rest of this video is an argument with. Let everybody live as he pleases. But the greatest majority, 99 out of every 100, live just as I have showed you, because it is more pleasant and more profitable to them. For anyone who does not want the palace, there are tents pitched outside it. In the dream, they are still standing. Her guide leaves the door open behind her. It is a solution freely entered, and nobody has been locked in. 2 years after Notes from Underground appeared, the state read Sechenov and agreed with the underground man. Hear him in his own words first. Man will become an organ stop, he says, and everything he wants will be tabulated in advance. On the 4th of April 1866, the Petersburg Censorial Committee entered the Golovachev publishing house. They confiscated 3,000 copies of Reflexes of the Brain, waiting there for distribution. In June, the committee issued Sechenov a written indictment. The charge reads that this materialistic treatise reduces even the best men to the level of a simple machine, devoid of consciousness and free will. It sweeps away good and evil, moral duties, the merit of good deeds, and the responsibility for bad ones. Sechenov, hearing that he would need a lawyer, said he would take a frog to court and perform his experiments in front of the judge. 2 years earlier, Dostoevsky said the censors had gone through his own book and taken out the chapter where he turned to faith. They cut Sechenov's last paragraph too, and it was a hymn to all-forgiving love. 2 opposed books, and the scissors landed at the same place in both. The Tsar's censors and the man under the floorboards agreed about exactly one thing. A machine has no merit and no guilt. Now the story everyone tells about this book. Dostoevsky, prophet of the soul, standing against the cold arithmetic of science. It is wrong, and the evidence against it is in his own handwriting. He owned Buckle. He read Sechenov within weeks of publication and kept the 1866 edition in his library. In a drafted open letter, he granted Buckle's thesis about people's outright. Buckle said climate shapes what a people becomes. Dostoevsky wrote that if that is right, then a consequence follows. Change the climate, and the mind that grew in it goes too. He granted that in writing the same year he was writing Notes. And the concession is on the book's first page, inside the line everybody quotes. I know nothing at all about my disease, he says, and do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it, and never have. That is where the quotation always stops. The sentence does not stop there, though I have a respect for medicine and doctors. He grants that medicine works, and he does not go. The argument only starts if they are right about the body. That is the ground he is standing on, not the thing he is attacking. Now the strongest thing that can be said against him. Quetelet, who started all of this, never claimed what the underground man says he claimed. He wrote that his laws held for large groups and could be applied to individuals only within certain limits. Matsnagor concedes the rest of it. Dostoevsky knew Quetelet's extreme and uncompromising acolytes far better than he knew Quetelet. So the great defense of the human person against the table may be an attack on a popularization. He is punching a summary of a book he did not read. Except that the popularization is what was printed in Russian. Here is Buckle himself in the first volume of the history, and his claim is about one man rather than a crowd. Given correct reasoning and complete knowledge of a man's disposition and circumstances, he could foresee the line of conduct that man would adopt. That was printed in Russian in 1861 and printed again in 1863. Then Zaitsev, who popularized him, flattened it further. Man in all his actions, from the most important to the most insignificant, obeys statistical laws. Dostoevsky sparred with Zaitsev in the press. You cannot call it a straw man when it is the sentence standing in the room. There is also a better account of what he was doing than fighting science. To Quetelet, the average man was an ideal. The closer a person comes to the average, he wrote, the closer he comes to what is good and beautiful. Significant deviations constitute deformity and disease. He extended the same rule to art, where verisimilitude requires coming as near the average as possible. Run that rule onto the person watching first. By that measure, the man who knows what is good for him and does the opposite is not a character. He is a deviation to be corrected, and so are you when you do it. The statistical norm is legislating aesthetics too. A novel about a spiteful clerk who acts against his own interest is, by that standard, unrealistic. Matsnagor's reading, published in 2021, takes it from there. Dostoevsky keeps probability and flips which end of the curve tells the truth. Outliers rather than averages are what disclose reality. She calls it a poetics of improbability. Which leaves the question this part cannot answer. Buckle got the letters right. The suicide column holds. The palace has aluminium columns, an awning half a verst across, and tents outside for anyone who wants them. Nobody has been coerced, and nobody has been lied to. If the table is real and correct and does not force anybody, what is left for you to object to? Part 4. The one thing you want that is not on the list. Suppose the list is complete. Money, safety, work you like, someone who stays, being left alone when you want to be. Add whatever you think is missing, and let the list be honest. Now suppose they can give you every item on it, and that they mean it kindly. The man in this book already has his answer, and it is not a refusal of the goods. He says he would creep into a hen house to keep out of the rain, and he would not call the hen house a palace out of gratitude for keeping him dry. Take the offer at full strength first, because the weak version proves nothing. Chernyshevsky's Palace of Crystal is the offer you were shown last part, with the doors standing open and nobody marched in. That is the doctrine the first half of this book is shouting at, the one the last part traced to Buckle's numbers. Its claim is that nobody knowingly chooses against himself, and the claim is a serious one. It is the founding assumption of every policy that works by giving people better options. One objection has to be cleared before any of that can be argued with. Bakhtin denies that these chapters can be treated as an argument at all. The speaker is unstable, and every sentence is a move in a quarrel rather than a claim offered for checking. This is a man who says a thing in order to eat it an hour later. So read what follows the way you read a case put by someone you do not trust. Do not ask whether he means it. Ask whether it holds when anybody at all writes it down. Chapter 7 attacks the doctrine in 4 steps, and the steps are worth having in order. First, rational egoism explains every action by some advantage to the agent, and it lists them: prosperity, wealth, freedom, peace. Second, people knowingly act against every item on that list and have done so for as long as there are records. Third, either those acts have no motive at all, or they answer to an advantage that is not on the list. Fourth, they plainly have a motive, because they are chosen, deliberately aimed, and often planned for months. So there exists in his phrase something dearer to almost every man than his greatest advantages. He names it. One's own free, unfettered choice, one's own caprice, however wild it may be. Then he adds the clause that decides everything, that this item does not fall under any classification and is not in place in any list. Now the move the summaries skip, and it is the difference between a philosophy and a mood. The obvious reply is to widen the ledger, and he writes that reply into the text before you can make it. Yes, but it's advantage all the same, you will retort. So add a column for independence, score it, and the accounting closes again. But look at what the column would ask of you. Suppose they score it. Then satisfying your independence means doing whatever the score says. But wanting on your own account just is the refusal to do whatever the score says. So the column would ask you to prove you are free by obeying it. It is not one more good sitting beside the others. It is a demand about who gets the last word, and a list cannot grant that, because the list is the thing being refused the last word. Notice that this needs nobody to be sincere. A column for independent wanting fails whoever writes it, because the failure is in the column. Philosophers now have a name for the reply he blocked. The Guise of the Good says that when you act on purpose, you must see some good in what you're doing. Joseph Raz presses it hard. Taking badness itself as your reason would be an incomprehensible thought, so we are forced to read the agent some other way. In any such case, Raz says, we may imagine there is some good in the action in the agent's eyes, and that this is his reason. Anscombe had already shown how far that rereading can be pushed through Milton's Satan. It ends in what she calls the intact liberty in the unsubmissiveness of my will, which is his answer, arrived at from the other end. He is naming the good and telling us it cannot be handed over. Which is where the henhouse stops being a joke. He will use the henhouse. He gets dry in it and takes the shelter without a word of thanks. The palace of crystal is the one that can never be destroyed. It is the one at which you cannot put out your tongue or make a long nose on the sly. The thing he wants cannot be given to him, because anything given to him is on the list. That is why the palace is unbearable and the henhouse is fine. The henhouse never claimed to be your life. Chapter 3 has the barest version of this, and it is only 2 men standing at a wall. The wall is the laws of nature. The impossible means the stone wall, he writes, and then asks what stone wall, and answers why, of course, the laws of nature. Both men know it cannot be moved. Both know they cannot move it. One is reconciled to it. The other refuses to be, and refuses while granting every fact the first man grants. The difference between them is not knowledge, not power, and not what happens next. Put two patients in that position. Same inoperable diagnosis, same scans, same treatment, and they die on the same day. One of them makes his peace with it in the third week and means it. The other refuses to be reconciled to the last hour, and the hour is not moved by an inch. No test separates them. No marker in the blood, no difference in behaviour, nothing an observer could write down. If that difference is real, then freedom is a stance rather than a power. And no ledger could ever record it, because there is nothing there to record. If it is not real, chapter 3 is empty, and so is he. This is where the position starts to give. Harry Frankfurt's word for a creature that simply acts on whichever want happens to be strongest is a wanton. Frankfurt's test is whether you have a want about your wants, whether you care which one moves you. A wanton is not free. He has desires and no stake at all in which of them moves him, and an uncaused act is not thereby yours. Wire a random number generator into your head, and you become less free, not more, because now something arbitrary is choosing, and it is not you. Caprice with nothing endorsing it from above is not autonomy. It is noise with a body. The reply the text supports is that his caprice is never random, because it is addressed. Every one of his stunts has a recipient, and fails completely if that recipient does not register it. A random number generator does not need an audience. He does not just want the thing. He wants the officer to see that he wanted it. That second wish is a wish about his own wanting, which is the test Frankfurt set. The content can be arbitrary. The stake in it cannot be. The harder attack does not come from philosophy. Psychology went looking for people who want harm as such, and kept coming back with something else. Baumeister and Scher gave the definition in 1988. Self-defeating behaviour is any deliberate or intentional behaviour that has clear, definitely or probably negative effects on the self. That is his own category, stated without any of his rhetoric. And the verdict, restated by Callan Kay and Daughtry in 2014, runs like this. Rather than being driven by a motivation for primary self-destruction, people who engage in self-defeating behaviours do so as a trade-off. Damage bought, and always in exchange for something. That is either a refutation or exactly the move he says will always be made. If the loophole is itself a trade-off, the ledger only ever needed one more line. And self-knowledge turns out to be the lever after all. Find out what you are buying, and you can stop paying for it. Even the enjoyment of his own degradation, the one pleasure he says needs no supplier, becomes a purchase with a price attached. Then there is a case that cuts both ways. In 1985, Eslinger and Damasio reported a patient known as EVR, after surgery removed tissue from both frontal lobes. His measurable intelligence was superior. Later testing by Saver and Damasio found moral reasoning at an advanced developmental level. It also found a normal ability to consider the future consequences of pursuing particular response options. The 1985 report is the one that records the damage. He could not meet personal and professional responsibilities. He was therefore considered a malingerer. Knowing your advantage does not suffice, and that buries the rational egoist. Now notice what it does to you. You have been treating the gap between knowing and doing as proof that you are more than a machine. In EVR, that gap is a hole in a man's head. The gap is real. It is just not obviously an achievement. So he proves he is not on the list by doing something that is not on it, which works once and only against someone who was not expecting it. A system that has already priced defiance is not startled by defiance. What happens when they see it coming? Part 5. What happens when they predict you? A model has flagged you as likely to cancel this month. You do not see the flag. You see an offer 3 months at half price arriving the week you started thinking about leaving. Underneath it, in smaller type, one more line. It's completely your choice. Take the offer and you did what the model expected. Refuse it and you did what the model was built to catch. Either way, the flag was right, and either way, the thing you would have called your decision was anticipated before you made it. Dostoevsky saw this coming, and the best thing in the book is that the underground man raises it against himself. In Chapter 8, he stops arguing and hands his opponents their strongest move. Suppose, he says, that all of this can be calculated and tabulated too. Chaos and darkness and curses. Suppose the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all, and reason would reassert itself. Then, he writes, man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. That is a bigger stunt than the one before it. He knows it, which is why the sentence ends in an exclamation mark. The trap closes in 4 steps, and the first 3 we have already run. Caprice is a natural process. Natural processes follow laws. Anything that follows a law can be written into a table, at least in principle. So the perverse act was only ever a row nobody had bothered to fill in. The 4th step is the one he never answers. Print that he will do the thing, and he does the other thing, which means the printing caused what he did. His defiance runs on the prediction. So you select his behavior by selecting what to print. The reflex contrarian is the most steerable person alive. Buckle's post office table only counted the people who had already forgotten the address. It sat in a book and described. The model that flags you reaches back and puts an offer in front of the person it just described. Leaving and staying are both inside its loop now. None of this is a thought experiment, because the trap has a research program inside it. Jack Brame named the reaction in 1966 and defined it narrowly. Reactance, he wrote, is a motivational state with a specific direction, namely the recovery of freedom. Threaten a freedom somebody already believes they hold, and the restricted option becomes more attractive to them. That is the underground man's central mechanism, restated as a law-like regularity. It comes with trait scales. You can be scored on how reliably you refuse to be told. Once resistance is measurable, resistance becomes a design input. A 2025 paper by Adam Troyan and Bélanger opens on the principle itself. The supreme art of persuasion, they write, is to sway the recipient without provoking reactance. The line that hands your freedom back has been tested. Bessarabova and colleagues ran it in 2013 to find out how well it works. So the small type is doing work. It's completely your choice is the sentence that converts. And the system already expects to be gamed. Mannheim and Garabrandt catalogue it as one of 4 ways a measure decays, and name it adversarial Goodhart. Being an adversary is a role the model has a slot for. Then there is the sharpest column of all, and it was measured in 16 countries. Hermann, Thony and Gachter ran public goods experiments in 16 comparable participant pools around the world. In some of those pools, people punished the high contributors as much as they punished the low ones. They paid out of their own earnings to hurt the people who had cooperated. In some pools, that antisocial punishment was strong enough to remove the cooperation-enhancing effect of punishment. And it was predictable from outside. Weak norms of civic cooperation significantly predicted where it appeared. That is spite with no way of laundering itself as justice. It is also spite with a regression line running through it. Zanfei and colleagues put the refusal itself into a scanner in 2003. Rejected unfair offers came with significantly heightened activity in the anterior insula. The refusal has a signature. Signatures are what systems are trained on. Now attack the tabulators because they have a real weakness, and it is not a small one. Stefan Rummans and Stefan Kuipers draw the distinction the whole dispute turns on. External predictability means prediction by an observer standing outside the universe, and determinism does entail that. Embedded predictability is different, because the predictor is itself a part of the universe it predicts. Its prediction is a physical event, and a physical event can be fed to a device built to do the opposite of whatever it reads. So the published table fails, and it fails in exactly one place. It fails on the person it describes. On everybody else, it works perfectly. David Wolpert proved something colder in Physica D in 2008. Wolpert has a term for anything that observes, predicts, or remembers. He calls it an inference device. A weather model is one. So are you. A strong one is a device that can answer any question about the rest of the universe correctly. Wolpert proved that no universe can hold 2 of them. Each can always be asked about the other, and the answers cannot both come out right. These results, he writes, hold independent of the precise physical laws governing our universe. So there is no seat anywhere inside the world from which everything in it can be predicted. That is where Laplace was wrong, and it is wrong even in a universe with clean, non-chaotic laws. Here is the limit, and it is where you get cheated. That removes the completed table. It does not remove the accurate prediction of you. You may have heard that telling people they are determined makes them cheat. Nadelhofer, Shepard, Krohn, Everett, Earp and Levy ran 5 studies to check, 4 of them pre-registered. They used the same or highly similar manipulations, and their efforts were largely unsuccessful. Being shown the table may not disturb you at all. So he wins, and what he wins is narrower than the fight he thought he was in. No table can ever be authoritative for the person it describes. Every table can still be right about them. He beat the almanac, he never touched the cause. Zamyatin took the table literally and built a state out of it, with numbers instead of names. In Record 8, the residue finally surfaces, inside the state's own mathematics. D503 cannot get rid of the square root of -1. Take that square root of -1 away, he writes. It could not be defeated because it was beyond reason. The state answers it surgically, which is the part worth staying with. Fancy is located as a nerve centre and cut out. If the residue is real, the residue is an engineering problem. Your version needs no surgery because it is quieter than that. Two people are flagged by the same model in the same week. They get the same offer with the same line of small type under it. Both click accept. One of them has been persuaded. The other takes the discount while refusing privately to be reconciled to any of it. Nothing in the data separates them. At the wall, that invisibility was the underground man's strongest argument. Here it is the cage. A difference nobody can see is a difference nobody can reach. Which leaves him holding something he never admits he is holding. The defiance proves nothing, and the refusal reaches nobody, and he goes on recommending it anyway. Not quietly either. He recommends it out loud as an instruction for another whole chapter. And if the one gesture left to a man who cannot win is to make no gesture at all, then his advice has an obvious shape. Do nothing. Part 6. Nobody made you stay down there. Two people take the same offer, and one of them has consented and one has not, and nothing in the data separates them. That withheld consent is the whole of what he has left. You would expect a man in that position to describe it as a loss. He describes it as a policy. You say your paralysis is something that happened to you. He says his was chosen, and he says it in the imperative, at volume. First, the image has to go. There is no basement. The Russian word is podpolye, built from the words for under and for floor. Its first dictionary sense is the storage crawl space beneath the floorboards of a house, where vermin live and people do not. The political sense, the clandestine underground of revolutionaries, is marked as figurative, and that expression entered Russian after the book was written. And the narrator does not live down there. His address arrives on the second page. My room is a wretched, horrid one in the outskirts of the town. A rented room on the edge of Petersburg with a servant. The English title has drifted twice. The first English translation by Hogarth in 1913 was published as Letters from the Underworld. That sends the reader to Hades. Constance Garnett corrected it in 1918 and gave us notes. The still common Notes from the Underground adds a definite article the Russian does not have. An article turns a condition into an address. And Dostoevsky first announced the work under a different title entirely. A confession. Now read the end of Part 1. 11 chapters of argument, and it does not close on a man admitting he cannot move. It closes on a cheer. The long and the short of it is, gentlemen, that it is better to do nothing. Better conscious inertia. And so, hurrah for underground. A man reporting a symptom does not end on hurrah. He is shouting a recommendation. And it is an argument, so take it at full strength. To act at all, you have to treat some reason as final. You stop asking why, and you move. Hyperconsciousness will not stop asking. Behind every reason it finds a further reason. Behind every motive, a further motive. Ask for the cause of the cause, and there is always another one waiting. So the search never terminates, and the man conducting it never reaches a reason he can stand on. The ordinary man who is stupider hits his final reason early and acts. Consciousness, the instrument the age was proudest of, disables action in whoever has the most of it. There is a second road to the same place, and he takes it in chapter 9. Suppose the good of a thing lies in the striving and never in the thing attained. He says it himself, and he hedges it. Perhaps the only goal mankind is striving for lies in this incessant process of attaining. Then every finished project destroys its own value at the moment it is finished. Striving is self-defeating by construction, and if that holds, the one coherent thing to do is nothing. The philosophy prescribes his inertia. He did not acquire it by accident and glue the argument on afterwards. The most famous line in the book is now unreadable in English, and the repair takes 3 steps. Step 1 is what you already carry. Winston Smith in a cell made to say that 2 and 2 make 5. 5 is the torturer's number, the lie you affirm once they have broken you. Step 2 is a poster. Yakov Gumina, 1931. 2 plus 2 plus the enthusiasm of the workers equals 5. 2 years of the plan plus 2 more is 4. The poster says 4 years of work will deliver the 5-year plan. 5 is what the state demands of you. Step 3 is the actual sentence, with the clause everybody drops put back. I admit that twice 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing. But if we are to give everything its due, twice 2 makes 5 is sometimes a very charming thing too. He concedes the arithmetic in the same breath in which he insults it. 5 is the one proposition whose only support is that somebody wanted it. And the genealogy everyone repeats is not documented. Orwell reviewed Eugene Lyons's assignment in Utopia in the New English Weekly on the 9th of June 1938, and that review is the link people name. Fetch it and search it. The formula is not in it. Nobody has produced a paper trail running from Dostoevsky to Orwell in either direction. The refusal has a precise shape, and you already have the image for it. He creeps into the henhouse, and he stays dry, and the one thing he keeps back is the thanks. What he wants is a door he can be seen walking out of. So the idea of a man too conscious to act gets him exactly backwards. He is holding a position, and the position is that not moving is the last thing nobody can take from him. He is not stuck. He is defending something. And now the position is in serious trouble, because part 2 is a scandal. The man who recommends doing nothing is the busiest character in the book. He spends years on a plan to bump a stranger's shoulder in the street. He paces between a table and a stove for 3 hours in front of 4 men who have stopped noticing him. He chases a sledge across Petersburg at midnight. Whatever consciousness stopped in this man, it was not action. The doctrine has a reply, and it is a good one. Every one of those acts is a lapse from the doctrine, which is exactly what you would predict of somebody who cannot hold it. But notice when the doctrine gets stated. The argument of part 1 is spoken by an older man about a life already lived, and every attempt in it has already failed. The philosophy arrives after the results are in. There is a name for saying the failure in advance. Psychologists call it self-handicapping, and it has a price tag attached. In 1978, Berglar and Jones gave students problems, some soluble and some with no answers at all, then told everyone they had done well. Half had earned the success. Half had been handed it. Then each of them chose between two drugs before a promised retest. One said to improve performance, and one said to damage it. Males in the unearned success condition were the only group that preferred the drug that would damage them, wishing to externalize probable failure. Self-handicapping is a purchase, and the currency is real performance. The receipt is a meta-analysis by Schwinger and colleagues, 36 field studies covering 25,550 students. Across them, the more a student self-handicaps, the lower the grades come out. The relationship is small and it is steady, minus 0.23. It protects and it costs. You know the sentence. You say it before the attempt, not after, and you say it so the result will have somewhere to go. The minus 0.23 is what you paid for it. And from the other side of the desk there is a colder description of the same behaviour. A contested clinical profile called pathological demand avoidance, never a recognised disorder, is defined by the obsessive refusal of ordinary demands. He is refusing the demand because it is a demand. 2 surveys of adults in the general population, 267 people, and then 549, asked what predicts that refusal. Autistic traits and anxiety came out as unique and equally important predictors. Sit with what that does to the sentence he is defending. He says, "This is my will, the one thing that is mine." If the refusal is a threat response, that sentence is what a person writes over it later. It fits perfectly, and it explains nothing. The critics have their own version of the deflation, and it is harder. Joseph Frank's reading, now the standard one, is that the whole performance is parody. A character assembled out of the radical's own premises run forward to show where they end. On that reading, there is no position here at all, only a demonstration conducted at the character's expense. Robert Louis Jackson goes further. In his words, there are no manifestations of freedom of will here. In his very efforts to declare his independence from the laws of nature, Jackson writes, "The underground man demonstrates his enslavement to them. A man who must always refuse is as legible as a man who always complies." Leave that standing, because it may be right. But both deflations describe something a person suffers, and one feature of the book fits neither of them. A threat response is miserable. A parody is somebody else's joke, made at his expense. The last chapter of Part 1 is neither miserable nor embarrassed. It is a cheer. You can hold a position without enjoying it. He enjoys it. Part 7. Why it feels good. 2 in the morning. You go back over the worst thing you did today in detail, and then you do it again. Not the whole day, just the one sentence, and the face that received it. The first pass hurts, and so does the second. Somewhere around the 5th, something changes, and going over it stops being punishment. You have stopped enduring the replay. You are the one running it now. The second chapter of Part 1 is that night written down. He is describing the hours after what he calls a loathsome action, done again and impossible to undo. He says he was secretly inwardly gnawing at myself for it, tearing and consuming myself. And then, till at last, the bitterness turned into a sort of shameful, accursed sweetness, and at last into positive, real enjoyment. 2 things in that sentence get dropped from almost every retelling. The sweetness is made out of the bitterness, by going over it repeatedly. It is a process, not a swap. And he names the content of the enjoyment. The enjoyment, he writes, was just from the too intense consciousness of one's own degradation. From feeling that there was no escape for you, that you never could become a different man. The sensible response is that the pain is not what he likes. He is buying something with it, and the thing he buys is what he likes. That response is right about most cases, and it has to be taken apart slowly because 3 different versions of it get run together. The popular version stops at the first one. The first version says the suffering is the price of freedom. He accepts a bad outcome in exchange for the right to want something stupid, and the right is the good. The trouble is that he performs this conversion himself in the same breath. The caprice, he says, preserves our personality, our individuality, which is worth more to him than what it costs. So a utilitarian just writes autonomy onto the list of goods and wins the argument. Anyone who stops at this reading has handed the ledger back to the accountant. The second version is sharper. The suffering is not a price, but a signal, a proof to yourself that you are still someone rather than something. Chapter 9 has it plainly. You can at least flog yourself at times, and that will, at any rate, liven you up. This is still instrumental, since pain is the means, and self-certainty is the end. But look at what it is instrumental to. A signal has to cost you something, and it has to be yours. If someone else arranges the cost for you, it proves nothing about you. So the state that hands out every other good is the one thing that cannot hand out agency. The third version is the only one that threatens anything. It says the object of the enjoyment is the badness itself. The awfulness is the content of the pleasure, the way a face is the content of a photograph. That is exactly what the sentence asserts. The enjoyment came just from the consciousness of being degraded, and the sweetness is called accursed, which keeps the negative sign inside the pleasure instead of cancelling it. Which is where the man with the month of toothache comes back, no longer as an illustration of the condition, but as evidence. By day 3, his moans have trills and flourishes. He is not moaning more simply as the pain wears on him. He is moaning worse, and the text says why. The malignancy is the whole point. That is a direction of increase. A compensation model predicts the opposite. Hold the compensating good fixed, and less pain is always better. Hume noticed the same wrong-way movement in a theatre audience, whose pleasure rises as their distress does. More pain, more enjoyment. No trade produces that. A trade only ever makes less pain better. The same direction runs through the slap he was never given, which is his strongest case and not his weakest. He goes over the blow that never landed until the consciousness of being rubbed into a pulp overwhelms him. No hand was raised. Nobody was in the room. He invented the event and then ran it again, which is precisely what you were doing at 2 a.m. So look at what the pleasure is actually made of, on his own account. The pleasure is not in the pain. It is in the certainty. There is no escape, and he can never become a different man. It is the one comfort that nothing which happens next can take away. For 2 centuries, aestheticians have been stuck on the same question about tragedy. People pay money to be made miserable, and nobody has explained how that is possible. One answer is the one that damages him most. Walton and others deny that the bad feeling is bad at all. What is disagreeable, on their view, is the situation we are sorrowful about, and not the sorrow. Applied here, he never enjoys degradation for a second. He enjoys a mental state whose object happens to be degrading, and that redescription costs a utilitarian nothing. The empirical support goes the same way. Rosin and colleagues measured enjoyment of initially aversive things, and their own mechanism is that the body has been fooled and there is no real danger. That is a compensation story wearing a lab coat. The only resistance worth stating is a complaint about method. A theory that absorbs every new case by adding one more term has stopped predicting anything. But a complaint about method is not a counterexample, and nobody currently has the account. Jonathan Mitchell has argued that the masochist breaks second-order desire accounts of why pain is unpleasant, a leading desire-based analysis. His conclusion is deliberately negative. Look elsewhere. And there is an explanation from outside that does not need him to want anything bad at all. Callan, Kay and Daughtry ran 4 experiments in which people who experienced or recalled bad breaks devalued their self-esteem. Those drops in self-esteem, they report, increase beliefs about deserving bad outcomes. 5 further studies followed the belief into behaviour. People claimed handicaps ahead of an ability test. They preferred others to view them less favourably. They reported chronic self-handicapping and thoughts of physical self-harm, and they chose to receive negative feedback during a test. The mechanism is not a taste for harm. Something bad happened to you that you did not deserve. A mind that needs the world to make sense cannot hold that, so it lowers you until the bad thing fits, and then it goes looking for proof. The replay at 2 in the morning is the proof being collected. Swan and his colleagues found the same shape in whom people choose to be around. Depressed students preferred interaction partners who had evaluated them unfavourably. They preferred friends and dating partners who did. Dysphoric students sought out unfavourable feedback from their roommates. People with negative self-views solicited unfavourable feedback, although receiving such feedback made them unhappy. Now the part that usually goes unsaid. The depressed group in the first study was 13 people. In the second it was 10, in the third 6. A large, popular psychology of self-sabotage rests on cells that small, and you should know that before you let it explain your life. Take all of it at full strength, and one feature of the comfort survives every redescription. It is completely private. No escape, never a different man, said to yourself in an empty room, requiring nobody's agreement and nobody's presence. It is the one pleasure that needs no external supply. And yet he cannot perform a single one of his humiliations alone. The moaning needs a household to keep awake. The confession needs gentlemen to address. If the comfort is private, why does every humiliation he stages require an audience? Part 8. The people you cannot stop needing. Somebody once moved you out of the way without looking at you. Not a shove, a hand on each shoulder, a small correction, and then they walked on. He was standing by a billiard table in Petersburg, in the way. An officer took him by the shoulders, moved him from one spot to another, and passed by as though he had not noticed him. Then comes the sentence. I could have forgiven blows, but I could not forgive his having moved me without noticing me. Take that seriously as a claim, and it says something precise. Blows would have been a relation. A man who hits you has admitted that you are there. He has taken a position on you, and a position can be answered. Being moved like a chair is the absence of any position at all. He says what he wanted instead, and he says it in the vocabulary of a genre. A real regular quarrel, a more decent, a more literary one. I had been treated like a fly. So he begins a campaign, and the length of the campaign is the argument. First he writes a story unmasking the officer's villainy and submits it to a journal. It is rejected. Then he composes a letter challenging the officer to a duel. He notes in passing that this was 2 years after the insult, and that his challenge would be a ridiculous anachronism. He does not send it. Then comes the Nevsky plan, which is the one he executes. He will walk down the Nevsky Prospect and refuse to step aside. Let the making way be equal, he says, as it is when refined people meet. He moves halfway, and you move halfway, and you pass with mutual respect. The plan requires a costume, and this is where the money starts. Black gloves and a decent hat, bought with an advance against his salary. Then the coat. It had a raccoon collar, which he calls the height of vulgarity. He had to change that collar at any sacrifice, and to have a beaver, one like an officer's. So he sells the raccoon collar. The balance he borrows from his office superior, Anton Antonich. He signs for it against his salary, due in a fortnight. Then the rehearsals. He goes out to do it and loses his nerve at the last second. He goes again. Once he flinches so badly that he falls at the officer's feet. His own sentence for that moment is the flattest in the book. He very calmly stepped over me while I flew on one side like a ball. The collision finally happens. They run full tilt, shoulder to shoulder, and he does not budge an inch. He passes on a perfectly equal footing. And here is what the victory rests on. He did not even look round and pretended not to notice it. But he was only pretending, I am convinced of that. The officer's mind is the payoff, and the officer's mind is not available. So he supplies it himself and closes the account. He goes home triumphant and sings Italian arias. The officer was afterwards transferred. What is the dear fellow doing now, and whom is he walking over? 2 years, a sold collar and a borrowed salary bought 1 second of a stranger's shoulder. And then he had to invent the stranger's inner life in order to enjoy it. There is a name for the structure underneath this, and it belongs to René Girard. The romantic account of wanting runs in a straight line from a person to an object. You want the thing because of what the thing is. Girard says the line is really a triangle. Between you and the object stands a model, and the model is what makes the object worth having. This is not the ordinary business of copying what the neighbours have bought. Girard's claim is stranger. The model is worshipped and hated in the same motion, because he is also the obstacle. The text supplies the proof in one line about the Nevsky. After my affair with the officer, I felt even more drawn there than before. It was on the Nevsky that I met him most frequently, and there I could admire him. He goes to the street to admire the man he is plotting to shoulder, and the collar shows the desire is copied. He does not want a collar. He wants that collar a beaver one like an officer's. The same structure runs twice more, faster each time. The farewell dinner he was not invited to, and invited himself to, funded by 6 rubles borrowed from Simonov. They changed the hour and did not tell him, so he arrives alone and waits. You already know what he does in front of that table for 3 hours. What matters here is the sentence he repeats to himself while doing it. I walk up and down to please myself, and no one can prevent me. That is the freedom formula of Part 1, quoted word for word into a room that refutes it. Then the sledge, the midnight chase through wet snow, where he runs both endings past himself. He discards the one where they beg his forgiveness because it is bad literature. The other ending is the one where he slaps Zverkov and is dragged out by the collar. He keeps that one, not because he wants it, but because the first one reads like a bad novel. Set that against the best laboratory measurement we have of spite for its own sake. Klaus Abink and Abdulkarim Sadrieh ran it at Tilburg University with 40 undergraduates. Each of them earned money first by evaluating advertisements out of Dutch magazines. Then each could destroy some of an anonymous partner's earnings. Destroying cost nothing and gained nothing. There was no offer to refuse, no insult, no inequality to correct, and no reputation at stake. The destruction choice sat buried inside a long, boring task, deliberately, so that nobody could guess what was being studied. In the open version, where the partner could see afterwards exactly who had burned his money, destruction ran at 8.5% of decisions. In the hidden version, where the damage could be blamed on chance, it ran at 39.4%. There is no sign of a downward trend across rounds. People do not learn their way out of it. So ordinary spite wants cover, and it drops to 1/5 of itself when the victim can identify you. His spite runs the opposite way. Anonymity would ruin the entire 2 years. If the officer had felt the shoulder and never known whose it was, nothing would have been achieved. The whole campaign is worthless unless the officer notices, which is why he has to invent the noticing. The Tilburg subjects are buying a pleasure that nobody watches. He is buying a verdict, and a verdict has to be pronounced by somebody else. That is the one thing he cannot allow, so he says it for the officer and calls it settled. All of which looks like a problem with a solution. Give the man standing, a rank, a rule about who steps aside, and the rage should go. Hegel closed that door. His argument about the master and the slave has a second half that gets skipped. 2 men fight for standing. One of them would rather submit than die, so he submits, and the winner becomes the master. Now the master has what he wanted. Somebody acknowledges him. But the somebody is a man he has just reduced to a tool. The master does not receive adequate recognition either. The one doing the recognizing has been proved a mere slave, and so does not count as a competent judge. Recognition taken by force, or taken from somebody you have made smaller, is worthless as recognition. You have run this experiment. With an apology you pushed somebody into making. It arrived, and it was worth nothing, because you could see the pushing inside it. So the demand is unmeetable by design, and not by any failure of policy. The shoulder was never going to work, and the failure began at his own door. One thing has to be conceded before the money. Petersburg ran on a table of ranks, and the officer outranked him. The rule about who steps aside was written, and it did not say the officer. So a shoulder nobody could be made to acknowledge was the only lever he could reach. Not the lever that produces what he actually wanted, the one that was available. You have reached for that lever yourself in the message you drafted instead of the conversation you owed somebody, and you know the ending because he sings his arias, and within days the triumph is gone. That is the flatness after an argument you planned for weeks and finally won. The thing stopped being worth having the moment it was yours. The whole rebellion comes down to a set of numbers you can read off the page. The 40 years of inertia are paid for by 6,000 rubles, left to him by a distant relation he never names. He owes Simonov 15 rubles, has owed them for ages, and then asks him for 6 more. On the night of the dinner, he has 9 rubles in the world, and 7 are already spoken for. Dinner for 3 costs 21 rubles, and 28 once he has forced his way in. And the 7 that are spoken for are the monthly wages of his servant, Apollon. That wage is where he makes his stand. He decides to withhold it. Here is the 7 rubles complete, he says, but you are not going to have it. Not until you come respectfully with bowed head to beg my pardon. The man who says he would blow the world to pieces to prove his will has one lever. It is money, and he tries it on a servant. He loses. Every relation in this part is an extraction. A shoulder he had to pay for, a verdict he had to invent, an apology he never gets. From Apollon he tried to buy a verdict from a man he had made smaller. A verdict like that is worth nothing. From the officer he needed a verdict from a man who counted, and that one was never going to be given. So he wrote it himself. So what happens when somebody finally gives him something he does not have to extract? Part 9. The offer you have to destroy. She came, voluntarily expecting nothing, having believed every word of the speech he gave her at the brothel. And she arrives at the worst minute of his life. He is in a filthy dressing gown, screaming at his servant about 7 rubles a month. That wage dispute is the whole of his sovereignty, and Apollon is winning it. Money is the only lever he owns, and he is about to use it on her. Start with what he told her at the brothel, because it was his best work. He gave her the pity, the family she had left, the coffin waiting at the end. He gave her his address, and when she uses it, he tells her exactly what the sermon was. Power. Power was what I wanted then. Sport was what I wanted. I wanted to wring out your tears, your humiliation, your hysteria. He spares her nothing. He tells the truth at the top of his voice, to a woman who came to be helped. Consider what her arrival actually is in the terms of the book. Every other person in Part 2 is a rival, an obstacle, or an audience. He plots against them, borrows money to reach them, and needs them to look at him. Liza is the only person who comes without being manoeuvred into coming. She came to an address he had given her on the strength of a speech. Nothing was owed to her, and nothing had been arranged. She is the one variable in the book he did not set. Now notice what he is ashamed of. He never mentions the cruelty again. What he cannot forgive is the dressing gown. He will never forgive her for finding him in it. He will never forgive her for the tears he could not help shedding in front of her. And he will never forgive her for the confession itself. Every item on that list is a thing she saw and he did not authorize. She answers by putting her arms around him, and he cries the line the whole book has been walking toward. They won't let me, I can't be good. Then 15 minutes of genuine hysterics on the sofa, and there is nothing false in them. And then, on the page, in real time, the accounting comes back. He becomes aware that it would be awkward now to raise his head and look her in the face. Their parts are completely changed. She is the heroine, and he is the crushed and humiliated creature she was that night. He wanted her tears at the brothel, but now that she is the heroine, what he needs from her has changed. He needs her to think well of him, and she is the one person here whose opinion he cannot arrange. He then states his own thesis twice, in 2 sentences, without being asked. I cannot get on without domineering and tyrannizing over someone. And then the harder one. With me, loving meant tyrannizing and showing my moral superiority. He adds that he has never in his life been able to imagine any other sort of love. He offers those 2 sentences as a description of the whole range of what he can perceive as love. So watch the 5 rubles at the speed at which he plans them. They are conceived while he is running up and down the room before she has finished crying. They are executed at the door, where he opens her hand and puts the note into it, and he refuses the excuse everyone would hand him. He says outright that he did it from spite and that it came from his evil brain. So affected, so purposely made up, so completely a product of books that he could not keep it up a minute. It was not an impulse, it was a plan, made while she was in the room weeping. When you narrate yourself doing a thing like that, the narration is part of the machinery that produces the act. Here is why the note is necessary. Everything else he has ever obtained from another person, he obtained by extraction. He plans, he manoeuvres, he forces the other person into a position where the thing comes out. He is doing to her what he has been doing all week to Apollon. Holding money and making the other person standing depend on it. And the payment destroys exactly what he wanted from her. Hegel's point about the master is that recognition from someone you have made inferior is worthless. The recognizer no longer counts as a judge whose verdict means anything. Run that in reverse, and the 5 rubles are self-cancelling. The moment she is bought, her regard stops counting, and her regard was the whole point. She offered that embrace to him with nothing asked in return. She offered it to the man who had just told her he used her for sport. He could not take it, because a thing you did not extract is a thing you never controlled. So he pays her in cash to turn it back into something he can lose. A minute later he finds the money on the table, a crumpled blue 5-ruble note, the one he had thrust into her hand. She has left it behind and gone out into the wet snow, and he never sees her again. His comment is the closest the book comes to a diagnosis of him. He was so lacking in respect for his fellow creatures that he could not even imagine she would do it. He did not predict her, and prediction was the one skill he had. And watch what he does with the next hour. He runs into the street, stops 200 paces on, and does not follow her. Instead, he turns the whole evening into a question about which is better, cheap happiness or exalted sufferings. He records that he stayed pleased with that phrase for a long time afterwards. He also records that he almost fell ill from misery. The phrase survived the misery, which tells you which of the two he was keeping. Two men stood at the same wall earlier in this argument. Same laws of nature, same impossibility, one reconciled and one refusing, with nothing visible between them. Now there are two people in one room, and the same wet snow outside. And the invisible difference that decides everything is not his refusal to be reconciled. It is her willingness to hand something to a man who had just finished explaining that he wanted her tears. The book's first adjective has been waiting for this scene. Garnett's "I am a spiteful man" is the sentence the English reception is built on. Mira Ginsberg's translator's note records the cost of that choice. Ginsberg writes that a direct contrast is often lost in translation. The Russian word at the start is zloy. It means wicked, and it also means spiteful. The word she pairs it with at the end of the book is dobraye. That one, she says, just means good. But if the first sentence says wicked, then it is a plea, entered before any charge has been read. And this scene is the verdict, because what he howls is that he cannot be good. Now the objection, and it is serious. Lisa is nearly silent. She gets a handful of lines in the whole book. She has no argument, no psychology, and no page on which to state a position. To make her the philosophical answer is to let a critic's preference do work the text withheld. And it is suspiciously convenient. The answer turns out to be the one the author professed elsewhere, in his own voice. In Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, written the year before, he called the alternative to egoism voluntary self-sacrifice, and he added that for this one must love. A reading that finds the author's known doctrine inside a silent character has proved very little. It has found what it brought. The reply does not rescue the position, and it should not. It relocates the difficulty. Notice what the objection asks for. It asks Liza to make a case. But a case only settles anything if people are moved by reasoning. That is the exact assumption the book has spent its first half taking apart. If reason cannot reach a man in the underground, then no argument can be the thing that reaches him. So the answer could never have arrived as an argument. It had to arrive as somebody walking through the door. Which leaves the two objections standing against each other, and the text does not adjudicate. That leaves the standing question of whether the story refutes the manifesto. There is a third answer, and this scene is the reason it survives. Part 1 does two things. It tears down the idea that people act for their own advantage. Then it puts something in the place it cleared, and what it puts there is caprice, wanting a thing simply because you chose it. The tearing down survives this scene. The replacement does not. Subtract advantage from what he does with the 5 rubles, and what is left is not caprice. It is dependence. A will that owned itself could have accepted the embrace and let it stand. You will meet this. Somebody offers you something you did not earn and cannot repay. And when the impulse that arrives first is the impulse to price it, you now know what the price is for. It is for turning a gift into a trade, so that you are the one who set the terms. And if that is the answer, the book has a strange way of giving it. It never says so. Nobody in these pages tells him what she was, or what he should have done instead. Everyone leaves that room wanting the chapter where he explains how to stop. No such chapter exists anywhere in the book. Part 10, the part where he tells you how to stop. The page is not there, and the author said it had been taken from him. On the 26th of March, 1864, days after the first half of the book appeared in his journal, Dostoevsky wrote to his brother Mikhail. The complaint is about one chapter, and the Russian word he uses for it means the penultimate one. Part 1 has 11 chapters, so the wound is chapter 10, the Crystal Palace chapter, where the alternatives to spite get named and refused. Here is what the letter says, in paraphrase. Better not to have printed that chapter at all than to print it as it stands, in snatched-out phrases contradicting itself. It was the main one, he says, the place where the essential thought is expressed. Then the accusation. The swine of censors passed everything, where he jeered at everything and blasphemed for form's sake. Where out of all this he deduced the need for faith in Christ, that was forbidden. The demolition was let through and the rebuilding was cut. Take that at face value, because it has earned face value. The manuscripts of the book do not survive, and the censorship files have never been found. The letter is the only witness there is, and the case for believing it is strong. A man inventing a literary alibi does not invent one that makes his own book look broken. What he reports is worse than a spoiled masterpiece. His own argument now contradicts itself on the page. And nobody writes to their brother to establish an alibi. On that reading, the book you have been listening to is a damaged text. The counterweight was written and then removed by a committee of officials, and what came back was mangled. Everything done with this book since follows from a whole. The underground man as the first existentialist, the honest man with nothing to offer. All of it an accident of censorship. A century of readings resting on a page nobody has ever seen. Two facts stand in the way, and neither of them is about censors. The first is the reprinting. He published the novella twice more, in his collected works in 1865 and as a separate edition in 1866. He never restored the cuts, and no statement of what those cuts contained has ever been found. The second fact is worse for the censorship story. The positive answer survives. Not in the novel, and not in a censor's file. It is in a private notebook, written the day after his first wife died. It opens with her in the room. Masha is lying on the table. Then the thought. To love a person as one's own self, as Christ commanded, is impossible. On earth, the law of personality binds us. The I stands in the way. And then the doctrine, stated flat out, with nothing held back. After Christ appeared, it became clear that the highest development of personality must reach a certain point. The point where a man annihilates his own I and surrenders it completely to all and everyone, without division or reserve. And this, he writes, is the greatest happiness. This is Christ's paradise. Now set the dates beside each other. Part 1 appeared at the end of March. His wife died in April. He wrote Part 2 in haste in May. The notebook entry sits between the publication of the first half and the writing of the second. He had the doctrine in explicit form, in his own hand, and no censor had touched a word of it. He had the whole of Part 2 still ahead of him. He gave the reader Liza instead. So run the restoration and see what you would have got. Suppose the cut passage exists, and suppose it says the plainest thing such a passage could say. From all this I concluded that a man must believe in Christ. Put that sentence in that mouth and watch it. You know the mechanism already because it has been running since the opening line. Every sentence he writes keeps the right to alter its own final meaning, which is the loophole. A confession of faith gets no exemption. It lands, and the next line hears it sounding devout and turns on it for sounding devout. The chapter caves in before it finishes. That argument works whichever side of the censorship dispute you stand on. A determinate answer in his voice would have had to be a sentence he could not take back afterwards. He has not produced one of those yet, and the book is nearly over. So here is the shape of it. Whatever the censor took, the answer was not lost with it. It was in his notebook in his own hand, and he left it out. He could not hand this narrator a sentence the narrator could not take back. And notice what the notebook concedes, because that entry is not a rebuttal. Love, as Christ commanded, is impossible on earth. The law of personality binds us, and the I stands in the way. So the obstacle the underground man builds his whole position on is the sovereign I. And Dostoevsky's own notebook grants that it is real. The passage that was meant to answer him agrees with the diagnosis and differs only about the cure. Press on the silence, though, because it cuts the other way as well. If that page existed, you would have it. Restore it in the next edition. Publish it somewhere else, or say in print what was taken. Dostoevsky had 17 more years of publishing life. He took none of the 3. The cleanest explanation is that there was no determinate text to restore, and the essential thought was an intention rather than a chapter. He took a 4th remedy instead. He spent the rest of his life writing chapter 10, and Sonia at the lamp is where it ended up. None of that is the page you came for, and the last words of the book are not the narrator's, and no censor put them there. He writes that he does not want to write any more from underground. Then a second voice speaks, in square brackets, in the editorial we. The notes of this paradoxalist do not end here, however. He could not refrain from going on with them, but it seems to us that we may stop here. Read that for what it admits. The manuscript continues. The man is still writing off the page, and somebody else has decided you have heard enough. The book does not end. It gets stopped from outside by a voice that is not his, which is the only ending available to a person who will not say a final word about himself. And if you were waiting for the page where he tells you how to stop, look at what you were waiting for. A sentence from him. One more accurate description produced by the same head that produced the problem, and delivered to you from inside it. His author had that sentence, wrote it down in a notebook, and would not give it to him. It has to come from outside, or the writing just goes on. So the book went out without its counterweight, and readers went to work on it. What did they make of a man his author had left unrefuted? Part 11. Why you liked him. You have been on his side for nearly 2 hours. So was everybody. The admiration is not a private lapse of taste, and it is not the mistake of careless readers. The most careful readers this book ever had made it too. One of them made it while holding a book that does not exist. The winter of 1886 into 1887, a bookshop in Nice. Nietzsche picks up a French volume called L'Esprit Souterrain, published in Paris by Plon. He writes to his friend Overbeck about it that February. He is not reading this book, he is reading 2 unrelated Dostoevsky texts bound together and presented as one continuous work about one hero. The first half is The Landlady, an early novella from 1847 with nothing to do with the underground. The second half is Notes from Underground, retitled Lisa, after the woman from the brothel. The translators were Elie Halperin Kaminsky, a Russian speaker, and Charles Maurice, a minor French poet with no Russian at all. They did not only cut, they wrote new prose into the book. The narrator is given a name, Ordinov, and a death. He died at 60, alone, poor. There is an invented editor who speaks in the first person and explains how he came by the manuscript. He bought it from Apollon. Apollon was Ordinov's servant. Ordinov detested him, and for that reason, the editor says, Ordinov made him his heir. You know that lever by now. 7 rubles a month, held back until the servant comes with bowed head to beg pardon, and the servant simply waits. The only instrument of will this man owns is purchase, and it fails him at home, and it fails him with Liza. In the French edition, the instrument is turned around and used on him. The servant he could not pay is the one who sells him to Europe. The invented editor also states the book's meaning before the book begins. This, he says, is the dismal history of a man who was the victim of his too vivid inner clairvoyance. The man saw himself and knew himself, and his fate is a sad answer to the ancient maxim, know thyself. No, it is not good for a man to know himself. Dostoevsky's own prefatory footnote is gone, the one declaring the notes fictional and their author a social type. The type who, in his words, positively must exist in our society. And the book now ends. Enough. I will write no more from my underground. Now everything is finished. Katia, Lisa, and 40 years. The end. Consider what has been done to him there. He was built so that no sentence about him could ever be the last one. 2 Frenchmen finished him off in a season. A name, an age, a death, an heir, a moral, and an ending with both women's names in it. Buckle's tables could not do that to him. The completed entry, when it finally arrived, was not statistical. It was literary, it was done by 2 Frenchmen with a publisher's deadline, and it is the version Nietzsche read. Then the fact that closes the case. Chapter 10 of Part 1 is the chapter Dostoevsky told his brother the censors had gutted. the one carrying the essential thought. It is also where the Crystal Palace and the hen house are. In the only edition Nietzsche ever read, that chapter is 2 sentences long. It begins with the word "but." Then, we inhabitants of the underground must keep ourselves on a rein. We can stay silent for 40 years, and then we talk and talk. That is the whole chapter. The Crystal Palace, the hen house, and the organ stop do not occur anywhere in the volume. Not trimmed, absent. Peter Boulogne gave the scholarly form of this in 2019. In Russian, Boulogne says the narrator works as a philosophical and ideological type. In the French, he becomes a purely psychological one. So the text Nietzsche praised for its psychology had already been rewritten into a psychological case, and his enthusiasm then taught Europe to read Dostoevsky through Nietzsche. The compliment everybody quotes is not about this book either. Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom I had anything to learn, happier even than the discovery of Stendhal. That is 1888 in Twilight of the Idols, and it sits inside an argument about the criminal type. The evidence he cites there is Dostoevsky's testimony about the Siberian convicts from House of the Dead. It is not about the man under the floorboards at all. The English half of the story has better manners and the same result. Walter Kaufmann, 1956, introducing his anthology Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, is careful and correct. I can see no reason for calling Dostoevsky an existentialist, he writes, but he does think Part 1 of Notes from Underground is the best overture for existentialism ever written. Then he anthologized Part 1. On the same page, he says Nietzsche read Notes from Underground. That is the error we have just spent 5 minutes correcting, and it is in the title. That frame is still the professional default. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry on existentialism still names this book as the best capture of the anxiety of choice. Boulogne's finding resets the question underneath that entry. The question was always what Dostoevsky gave the existentialists. It cannot be asked about Notes from Underground. It can only be asked about the French book Nietzsche actually held. The philosophers kept Kaufmann's frame. The slavists abandoned it. And now the objection that takes the whole story away from me. Everything so far explains a man in Nice being moved by a hero somebody handed him. It explains nothing about you. You are holding the right book. You have Chapter 10, the palace, the hen house, the footnote calling him a specimen, and the voice that cuts him off at the end. You had the same reaction he did. So the wrong book is an alibi, and a comfortable one, and it has to go. The correction that survives needs nobody's intentions and no edition history. It runs on the existentialist's own criterion. One premise from Sartre decides the case. Freedom is realized only in what you project and what you do, and is nothing without such action. Take that as a test in 3 steps. First, a freedom that never issues in an act is not a realized freedom. Second, his defiance is unintelligible without somebody to defy, and he never acts where nobody is watching. The shoulder bump, the dinner, the sermon at the brothel, each one is a scene, and each scene has a house. Third, a will whose content is fixed by what an imagined listener will think is not self-determination. It is determination by the other, wearing the costume of its opposite. That costume is what Sartre called bad faith. So the exhibit the existentialists installed at the front of the gallery fails their own entrance exam. He says it himself in the most damaging sentence in the book. Perhaps it is simply that I am a coward, and perhaps that I purposely imagine an audience before me in order that I may be more dignified while I write. That comes 3 sentences after he insists he will never have readers. The device you heard in his opening 3 sentences is here running at the scale of a whole book. Now concede what is true, because the correction was never that he is wrong. Consciousness really does exceed calculation. The piano key argument really does land against a crude psychology of advantage, and nobody has retired it. And being right bought him nothing at the time. The reply to the radicals landed on silence in 1864. Almost no critical response. One quick parody by Saltykov-Shchedrin mocking the sick hero and the gloomy tone of his narration. Nothing serious from the major critics until after Crime and Punishment. The argument is good, and the life is a wreck, and the book sets them beside each other on purpose. He is right about freedom, and he uses being right about it in place of ever using it. That is what the book puts on the page. There was a man with toothache in part 1, moaning for a household that listens with loathing and believes not a word. He knew the moans cured nothing, and he refined them anyway, with trills and flourishes, because he was heard. The moan needs a hostile witness. So does the book. It is a confession composed for readers its author insists he will never have, and the readers arrived, and they admired him. You are the household. He wrote that he purposely imagined an audience in order to be more dignified while he wrote. For 160 years, the audience volunteered. Every reader who has ever admired him is the last line of the experiment. Which leaves your own habit standing somewhere new. The accurate, unflattering sentence you say about yourself before anyone else can say it is not the start of repair. It is the closing move of the performance, and it works. It worked on Nietzsche, who never read the book. It worked on a century of readers who took a diagnosis and used it as a program. So the way out is not a better description of yourself. A better description is more of the same currency, spent the same way, on the same thing. The way out is the one move the whole apparatus exists to prevent. Letting a sentence about you be said by somebody else and not answering it. Whether that is available to anybody, the book does not say. It does not end. It stops, and the last words are not his. Somebody else says that we may stop here.